Hello and welcome once again to the Just In Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. I just want to give you a reminder that I do, as I do every time, that we are donor supported as an organization. So if you would like to help support Just In Center, you can go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page, help us out there. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts that you give to us are tax deductible. So if you'd like to see these educational theological materials continue and go out to the world, then you can help us out that way, or just by watching our videos, purchasing our book materials, and by your prayers. So the topic today is we're talking about apologetics, but really more than apologetics. We're talking about some kind of changes that have occurred within the mindset of many Christians. Particularly, we're talking about evangelicals. At least that's what kind of spurred on the conversation that we're having today, but it's really not just about that. These are some things that really affect the entirety of the church. The reason I'm talking about this is I had a conversation with Trent Horn recently, and we were talking about why it is that among Roman Catholic apologists, the arguments that are going to be given for the existence of God tend to be those kind of classical arguments that one is going to find in St. Thomas Aquinas or in other medieval theologians. But among at least kind of evangelical apologetics, those who are kind of more of the William Lane Craig type of school, those who come out of Biola, they really don't make those arguments at all. And they're relying on really an entirely different set of arguments for the existence of God. And in this conversation, we were talking about kind of the history of why it is that happened. So the question is really, why did so many people, Protestants in particular, but really largely evangelicals, we're not just talking about that, why did they start to kind of abandon some of these classical arguments for the existence of God and then move toward a very different set of arguments? Now, underneath all of this is really a philosophical change, because something that you find in Thomas Aquinas' classic arguments for the existence of God, known as Thomas's 5 ways, they rely on certain assumptions about the way that the world works that were challenged during the age of the Enlightenment, which means that if you don't have certain assumptions about how the world works that are shared with someone like Thomas Aquinas, then the arguments themselves don't really work very well. So they kind of necessitate a whole view of how reality works and what nature is and what being is and what goodness is, that the world starts to move away from in the post-Reformation era, which to many people has really made those arguments not quite as viable today as perhaps they were at one time. Now, I think this is mistaken. I use a classical approach in my own apologetics. I share many philosophical, foundational views of the world, commitments that are present within St. Thomas Aquinas, not absolutely everything that he says. And I think that the arguments are still just as valid as they were then. But there is a bit of kind of philosophical groundwork that has to be laid before those arguments are really comprehensible. So to some extent, I think there's this issue of accessibility, that maybe those arguments aren't as accessible because so much more needs to be explained and understood before they can really be understood in their full weight, at the very least. So what I'm going to do, though, here is I'm going to discuss history, and I'm going to present a history as to why it is that people started to move away from these classical perspectives. Now, I am going to do a little bit of self-promotion here, so forgive me for that. But because I am talking about an issue that I've written on quite a bit here, I do want to recommend, if you want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the things we're going to be talking about today, I've written 3 different books that address these issues. And the first of these is my Prolegomena volume, A Defense of the Scholastic Method. And this is a revised version of my doctoral dissertation. And this book deals with the questions of philosophy and classical philosophy. And I address why it is that so many, and I'm particularly dealing with Lutherans because that's my theological background, but these things do apply much broader than that. But why it is that Lutheran theologians in the 20th century especially started to move away from some classical views of philosophy, the relationship between theology and philosophy, and other metaphysical issues and other broader philosophical issues. And then I present what is the scholastic method or scholastic approach to theology. Then there is a follow-up book on this. This is a part of a series, and this is a volume on the doctrine of God, a defense of classical Christian theism, that discusses some of these philosophical issues as well and relates them to the doctrine of God. So this is a discussion of how it is that the way people perceive of God and speak about God has changed because of a number of philosophical shifts that have happened within the Western world. So if you want to explore this more, particularly how this relates to the doctrine of God, how we view God, which then certainly relates to arguments for God's existence, you might want to pick this up. So then I have one final book I'll mention of mine, and that is a book called In Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful on the Loss of Transcendence and the Decline of the West, which is a broader overview of the move away from realist metaphysics in the modern world. So it's an overview text. So that's going to give you just a history of how Hume and Kant and some of these Enlightenment figures started to move away from and abandon classical approaches to the world. If you want to see a book that deals with classical apologetic arguments, with our publishing house, with Justin Center, we put out a book by Nathan Greeley, who's our fellow of philosophical theology, that is called Christian Apologetics. He also has a new book, Philosophy and Theology, a Lutheran Approach, dealing with these issues too. So lots of material on this subject if you want to check any of those things out. Let's talk first then about what the classical arguments for the existence of God are. So if we're talking about Thomas Aquinas's, say, 5 ways, what are Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs of the existence of God? Well, the first of these is the argument from motion. Essentially, this is the argument that says there is motion in the world, and motion doesn't just come from nowhere, right? Nothing moves unless it is moved by another. And so for anything to move, it has to have the power of motion that was derived or is derived from somewhere else. And so there can't just be an infinite chain of movers that something or someone moved something or someone as a kind of infinite regress. But there has to be a source of motion altogether. There has to be some primary source where motion comes from, and this is what is referred to as the unmoved mover, who is referred to as God. Now, there are certain assumptions that somebody has to have to really understand what Aquinas is doing here, particularly a distinction that he makes between act and potency. And so for St. Thomas Aquinas, he takes this from Aristotle, all things that exist both in act and in potentiality. And so objects that exist, people that exist, we all have things that are being enacted at one particular time, potentialities that are in action, and we have other things that we could potentially be or be doing. And so as a human being, I have, say, the potential to shave my beard, but that only exists in potency within me because I'm not going to do it, right? So I'm not going to enact that. But there are things that were a potential in me that I am enacting right now, right? I am speaking. And so I exist as a number of potentialities and actualities all at once. And so you have to really understand that to really get what St. Thomas is doing there. Then we have the second argument, which deals with efficient causes. And this essentially says that, well, things just can't be self-caused. And so we all have, or everything has a cause somehow. And so we can't, again, have this infinite regress of causes just ad infinitum. There has to be some primary cause. And we have a distinction between primary causality and then secondary causality. And so we speak in theology about God as the primary cause of all things. He uses secondary causes. We are means by which certain things are enacted, but we are not primary causes. We don't enact things just kind of ex nihilo, out of nothing. We all act within powers that are granted to us, that we have received. Then we have the third argument, which deals with contingency, possibilities, and necessity. Essentially, this says that the things in the world that we know in the world, that we encounter, they're all contingent, right? Everything is dependent upon something else, and they don't exist of necessity, right? My own existence is not something that is necessary. It's not necessarily inherent to my own person and being that I must exist. I exist because a series of contingent factors have come into play that have created me, that I exist and I am instantiated as this particular individual that I am. But not everything can simply be contingent. You can't have just an infinite number of contingent things that are all dependent upon one another. There has to be something non-contingent upon which contingent things depend, and that is God, right? So God is what we say is a necessary being, not a contingent being. Then we have the argument from gradations of being or perfections, which is the fourth argument, which essentially says when we make judgments about things in the world, say we call something good or we call something beautiful, we are always judging by some kind of standard, right? So even if that's like unrecognized, so you might not know, for example, what the standard of beauty is, which is always a difficult thing to do and discuss, but nonetheless, for you to make a judgment call about something, when you mean something more than just subjective appreciation of something, if you're speaking about something that's more objective than that, you're weighing it against a standard. And so the argument here is that when we see, say, beauty or goodness or truth or something like that, that we are valuing or being, we are valuing and evaluating in our lives, in our own experience, there must be some objective, beautiful thing or someone, right? Or good thing or someone, which is why we refer to God sometimes as the good, as some of the classical philosophers did. And so there is God who is the standard of goodness. He is that by which our judgments about the world come. And whether we recognize that he is that standard or not, when we are judging things to be, say, good or bad or good or evil, we are judging them by some kind of inherent standard. Even if we don't recognize that as God, we are acting as if there is an objective standard by which those things are being judged. Okay, then we have the argument from final causes, or the teleological argument, which is the argument number 5. Teleological means that there is purpose. There's purpose in the world. There are ends that exist within things and processes in the world. In other words, the world is imbued with meaning, and meaning means that we both have purposes for which we are made and we act, and then ends toward which or for which we act. And this is true of all people and all things, and it doesn't have to be a conscious thing. It's not like plants grow with a conscious knowledge of what they're doing and how they're contributing to the world. But the point is to say that there are purposes in all things that happen within nature, or within us and with the things that we do. We act with goals in mind. And oftentimes those smaller goals are done for the purpose of bigger goals and bigger goals. So the point is that in this argument, it says that there is a final end toward which all ends point. So the purposive nature of our existence, the fact that we are acting with purpose, we are living with purpose, we see purpose in the world, that there must be some final purpose toward which all of these ends are pointing, this final cause, as we call it. Okay, those are the Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways, totally inadequately explained because this is very quick, and I'm sure there are tons of objections to everything that I said, but this video is not a video to get into that. Okay, so this is a historical overview video. If you want me to do one that's defending Thomas's 5 ways and actually getting into the details here, I totally can do that, but it necessitates a lot of groundwork first, so it takes a little while to kind of get there. So those are the classical Thomistic arguments. Now, these aren't the only classical arguments for the existence of God. It's not like Thomas is the only person that ever talked about this. There are plenty of arguments that come from St. Augustine. Some of these really appear in St. Augustine, maybe not as systematically. And then we're talking 4th to early 5th century. And we find these arguments in St. Anselm, for example, within his Proslogion and Homologion. He has a couple arguments for the existence of God. So we're not just talking about St. Thomas, but he's the one who lays out the most systematic ones, and his are probably the most influential of these. So what are kind of the popular arguments that you're going to tend to hear today? Now I'm talking not about like really pop apologetics. Now I'm talking about those who are more engaged in philosophical apologetics. So William Lane Craig is probably J.P. Moreland. Those are kind of going to be most significant examples. William Lane Craig is really more influential probably than any other philosopher in recent history. I certainly think that Craig he's a brilliant man, and he certainly has things that are worthwhile to say. but I do have some concerns about William Lane Craig in both theologically and philosophically. But let's talk about what I think are some of the most popular arguments that you're going to find today. One of those is the column argument, the column cosmological argument. It's similar to the causal argument of St. Thomas in some ways, but in reality, it probably sounds more similar than it actually is, because I think they mean two very different things by the word cause. But the column argument essentially says that everything that has a beginning, so now we're talking about time. So Thomas's arguments actually are not about time, and a lot of people tend to think that they are, which is where people go wrong in understanding Thomas, is that his arguments don't depend on the world having a beginning. Now, of course, I think the world has a beginning, and I believe Scripture certainly teaches that, so I believe that as a Christian. But the argument for the existence of God, actually, for St. Thomas, doesn't depend upon the earth having an actual beginning, which I actually think makes it a lot stronger, because when you do that, you can avoid all of the questions of origins, and you can get more to the real philosophical groundwork. I think often the question of origins is one that tends to muddy the conversations in apologetics and when you're discussing things more than anything else. It's not to say they aren't important questions and we shouldn't be dealing with them, but in many ways it seems like kind of a distraction oftentimes in these conversations, where I think Thomas's arguments, when you understand them rightly, really show that regardless of the origins question, God needs to exist as a first cause, because we're not really talking about we're not going back in history necessarily. But the column argument is doing that, right? So it's talking temporally. So it's talking about those things that have a beginning. So nothing begins to exist without a cause of its existence, which seems to be kind of pretty obvious principle, honestly. We've never seen a thing that's just self-caused, that brings itself into existence from nothing, which doesn't really... It's incomprehensible, right? It's a logical possibility. And essentially he says, or this argument says that, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause, and that is God. Now, the point where this is going to be challenged the most is going to be dealing with that claim that the universe had a beginning. And so those who defend the column argument are going to spend a bit of time trying to prove that the universe must have had a beginning, or that time cannot just be infinite. And I think actually those arguments work pretty well. So I'm not going to say that the column argument doesn't work. And so I'm not going to say that it's a totally mistaken argument. I think that Thomas's arguments are stronger. But here's just a quick point to make, right? So people might claim that time is just infinite. And so we can theoretically perceive of an infinite future, because certainly you could have, say, an infinite series of numbers in mathematics. And it's true, you could have an infinite future. We could have an infinite number of points moving forward into the future that just never ends. But it's a lot more difficult to try to make a claim that not only is there an infinite future, but there's an infinite past. Because if there is an infinite past, that means that there is an infinite amount of time from the past to today. And if there is an infinite amount of time between the infinite past and today, then today could not have yet happened, because it hasn't been an infinite amount of time since the past, right? So we can conceive of infinity in one direction, but we can't really conceive of infinity in the other direction. It doesn't really seem to make sense. Now, there are responses to that, of course, but I'm just giving you the basics here. So that's the column argument, basically. Then we have, the argument from design. This is, of course, very, very popular. So you're going to see this among, say, intelligent design theorists or something like that, someone like William Dembski. And these kinds of arguments are going to talk about the complexities of the world. And they're basically going to say that a world of complexity cannot exist just randomly. Like the complexity in the world necessitates that there is somebody who has put that complexity together. And the intelligent design theorists talk about this as irreducible complexity. And there are different ways to frame this. And of course, there are ways to affirm, say, a theistic evolution and also use the complexity argument as well. So it's not just an anti-evolutionary argument, because you could make the same kind of argument about, evolution being a process whereby a complexity comes about by a God-created process. So whatever argument people are going to make, because you find both of those and all sorts of different kinds of that. it really all, in some ways, goes back to the William Paley argument. And so William Paley famously used this argument that God is like the watchmaker, right? So he says basically that, if you find a watch, if you just say found a watch on the ground, right, and you picked it up, you would never look at that device and say, well, that must have just happened by random chance, right? There must have been some kind of process where these pieces just all eventually came together and it just happened to work to tell time in this way. And so the argument is, well, we know that from experience, and you know that intuitively, that you can't have this kind of purposeful complexity, right? It's not just complexity in a general sense, but it's complexity that has a particular purpose and end in organization. Things can be complex, but also non-functional, right? Things can be complex and also, ugly and incapable of doing anything meaningful. So you have to have something that is both complex and organized in a coherent way. So intuitively, you'd know that, right? If you pick up the watch, someone told you it just came about randomly, you just wouldn't believe it. You know that's false. And so the argument is that, as Paley says, well, like the biological world is a heck of a lot more complicated than the watch. So if you're going to say this about the watch, why would you not also say the same thing about that, which is way more complex than the mere watches? And I think the argument works as far as it goes, but it doesn't. In some ways, it doesn't prove enough. And so the deists, those who believe that there is a God, that this God is some kind of great being that created this earth or the universe, but the deists would say that, okay, yeah, there is a God or some kind of great powerful being that made things. And it's the only way to explain this kind of complexity. But that God is not really involved in the world today, because you think about the watchmaker, right? The watchmaker is not actively involved in the day-to-day operations of the watch. It doesn't sustain the watch in existence. The watchmaker just made the thing and then just lets it go. So maybe the world is like basically this machine, like a watch, and God just makes the whole thing and then just kind of lets the whole thing run on its own. That's the basic argument the deists could use to defend their view. So, and no arguments for the existence of God are going to get you to the triune God of Scripture by themselves. They're not. Like, we need supernatural revelation. But at the same time, I do think that St. Thomas's arguments, if you understand them rightly, what they do prove is a lot more than there was some kind of being that created things. Because you could have an intelligent design argument that relies on aliens. But Thomas's arguments are talking about not just about there being an origin, but they're speaking about the power of motion as it's given now. So quick explanation here. And this illustration comes from the Roman Catholic philosopher and apologist Edward Feser. And Ed Feser has some really helpful work on this that is done at a popular enough level, I think, that most people can really grasp. And he has a book called Five Proofs, or is it Five Arguments for the Existence of God, or Five Proofs for the Existence of God? Feser is his name. So you'll find it if you look him up. And it's not just a reiteration of Thomas's five ways. He has others there too. But it's a really helpful book. But here's an illustration that he gives. And he says, to say that there is just an infinite number of movers is like saying that there are just, an infinite number of cabooses on a train that just move each other. And, if you just saw this really long line of one caboose pulling another, pulling another, pulling another, pulling another, if you ask somebody, hey, how are they moving? We say, well, that caboose is moving that one. Well, that one is moving that one. Well, that one's moving that one. Like, that you can't just have an infinite chain of cabooses moving each other because they don't inherently have the power of motion in themselves. So you can't just ignore the fact that they are in motion by just pushing it off to say, well, they're just an infinite number of cabooses, because even if there are an infinite number, they're still like contingent. They're dependent things. They're dependent on something else to move them. And you can't just have a bunch of things that are all moving that are all contingent upon something else to move them. You need an engine, right? So the engine is a necessity to move them. And so if you look at that illustration, this shows that we're not just talking about like what made the cabooses, right? But why are they moving now? What's giving them the power to move? What's their cause? The primary cause of their motion, because it can't just be in themselves. And it is that the train is actively moving them. So again, I think they're more powerful arguments, and I think they're logically more powerful, and I think they prove a lot more. But let's then get into the real question of this video. What happened that we have moved away from the earlier Thomistic arguments And then we have moved into these other arguments. Now, the two that I mentioned aren't the only ones, of course. There are plenty of others as well, but people aren't really within the evangelical world, at least relying on the classic Thomistic arguments anymore. I'm going to give 4 reasons here, and I'll outline these as much as I can. There's a lot in all of these, and it would take much longer than I have time for here in one video to discuss all of these. But the first thing I want to talk about is that there is after the age of the Reformation, right, after the time of the Reformation, so we're talking 16th century into the 17th century, there is a move away from the dominance of St. Thomas Aquinas' philosophy and his system. Now, we got to say that this move away from Thomas is one that occurs prior to the Reformation, and this shows up with the movement known as medieval nominalism, and we'll get into the details of that. But you have certain figures like William of Ockham, probably being the most well-known one, Gabriel Biel, who move away from some of the classical philosophical assumptions that help to form Thomas Aquinas' views and help to form then his arguments for the existence of God. Now, if you look at the Reformation itself, there is often a perception that people have that the Protestant Reformation moved away from the use of philosophy and theology. It's a wrong perception, and I kind of understand where the perception comes from because Martin Luther does have some pretty strong quotes about Aristotle, but the concern that the Reformers had, and I'm talking more about the Lutherans, this is true of the Reformed as well, I'm just not as well versed in those sources, but the concern that the Reformers had about philosophy was that they felt that there were times in which there was supernatural revelation, things that God revealed in his word, that tended to be explained away or explained in such precise categories so that they had to make coherent logical sense within, say, a more Aristotelian framework. The Reformers were thus concerned about the issue of the conflation of that which comes through what we call natural revelation, right, which is through God revealing himself through nature, that which we can discover through the use of our God-given reason, and supernatural revelation. And supernatural revelation is what God reveals specifically in his word. And so there was a concern among the Reformers that there were things that were divine mysteries in Scripture that were being explained with tools that are really to be used in terms of natural revelation, or for the purposes of understanding natural revelation, and for the purposes of understanding justice and law in this world. And so there's a conflation of the use of where philosophy fits. That's the primary concern that the Reformers have. It's not that there's a rejection of philosophy altogether. It's not just a rejection of classical philosophy. And so when you look at the post-Reformation theologians, the one who's my personal favorite, and I think he's just the greatest of the Lutheran theologians, or the theologians coming out of the Reformation altogether, is Johann Gerhard. Now, Johann Gerhard, he lived in the 17th century. In some ways, I'd probably call him the Lutheran St. Thomas Aquinas in terms of his depth and of knowledge and his extensive writing. So this is his Theological Commonplaces, this volume on the nature of God and the Trinity. This outlines his views of God and who God is. Now, if you read through this volume, he addresses the question of whether God exists, as someone like St. Thomas does. And in the midst of that, he provides the same arguments that one is going to find in Thomas Aquinas. And he cites Thomas explicitly. And so Johann Gerhard uses Thomas's arguments, and he uses Augustine's arguments and others from the church as well. He's not just relying on Thomas, but he holds to the same basic proofs, the same approach to reality, the same approach to nature and to knowledge of God that one would find within the medieval scholastic sources. And again, Gerhard's no insignificant figure. It's often said among Lutherans that there are 3 in a line of Lutheran theologians of whom there is no fourth, right? These 3 are more important than everybody else, and that's Martin Luther, Martin Chemnitz, and Johann Gerhard, right? So these are the kind of big 3 of Lutheranism. And Chemnitz reiterates all these same points as well. So, but Gerhard's a little more in depth on this particular issue. But something that you do find among the at least Lutheran theologians and the Reformed as well, and you see even this in Calvin, is that when post-Reformation Protestant theologians speak about knowledge of God, they're going to say that there is a twofold knowledge of God that comes through nature. There is that which is innate and that which is acquired. Now, Thomas is going to focus more on this acquired knowledge, and that's where the five ways come in. And someone like Gerhard or Calvin is going to say that there is an acquired knowledge, which is to say that we can observe the things of nature, and by looking at the things of nature, the visible things of nature, we can reason toward an invisible cause, a first mover, an unmoved mover, and that is God. And so we could make that kind of argument. This is largely derived from Romans chapter 1, where St. Paul talks about this. Through the visible things, the invisible things have been clearly seen. I have a lot to say about that because I think that the way that Paul uses language there, he's depending upon a realist metaphysic. That's a more classical approach that one finds in someone like a Plato or Aristotle, though obviously they're not the same, but at least one form of kind of classical philosophy. But then there is also this innate knowledge that stands alongside of that. And innate knowledge is what Calvin refers to as the sensus divinitatis. So this idea that there is a sense of God, of the divine, that is innate within our being and in our hearts. So there is a knowledge that we already have. So there's knowledge we can derive of who God is, but there's also knowledge that's just imprinted on our nature. And the focus of the post-Reformation theologians on this sensus divinitatis really comes from their dependence on St. Augustine. St. Augustine famously refers to this when he says, our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee, that there is this kind of knowing of God that's inherent in the heart, that we're always searching for something, but internally there's something in us that knows that God is that which we are searching for, even if we can't name it. But we also can talk about this as the knowledge of God in the conscience. So this is often associated with conscience. And this, again, derives from St. Paul's letter to the Romans in Romans chapter 2, when Paul is talking about those Gentiles who do by nature the things that the law requires, they become a law to themselves. Which is to say that even though they don't have the revelation, say, of God's law as God gave it through Moses to the Israelites, the Gentiles still know God's law because it's imprinted on us. Like there's an inherent sense that some things are right and some things are wrong. And these things, in our sense, of course, our conscience can be distorted. But generally, the what we understand in the conscience, the sense of right and wrong, is going to align with knowledge of God's law. And so there's an innate sense of God's existence and his law within our natures. And that's important to point out here in this discussion, because that focus on that sensus divinitatis does start to shape the way that apologetics are done in certain spheres. And so there is, in some ways, not as much necessity in those derivative proofs of the knowledge of God, when some apologists and theologians start focusing more so on the fact that all people already have this inherent knowledge of God that maybe needs to be brought out and can be perhaps brought out by those classical arguments, but it makes them a little bit less necessary. Now, that depends on the theologian, but I think the place where you see this most clearly is within the arguments and philosophy and apologetics of Cornelius Van Til, who's a Reformed apologist who really has shaped the way that a certain wing of the Reformed community understands apologetics, where apologetics is not so much about this derived knowledge or proving philosophically that God exists, but instead bringing out that or exposing that innate knowledge that one already has. So just to say that there's a reason why that tends to show up among the Reformed theologians eventually. And the roots of it are kind of here, but you don't have to do that if you believe in the innate knowledge of God. Because again, Scripture speaks of both, and we have figures like Gerhard speaking of both as well. Okay. Now, the part of the story and the move away from more classical philosophy, classical realist metaphysics and philosophy, is that it's not just within the Protestant world. And I think this is something that you often hear this or get this kind of perception that it's the Protestants moved away from classical approaches to philosophy, and the Protestants moved toward a more, say, skeptical view of the world, or the Protestants started to, say, divorce theology and philosophy, or the Protestants started to say that there's kind of maybe no need to prove anything through philosophy because we just have the Bible, or there's this kind of anti-intellectualism that grows out of this, and therefore the issues of the Enlightenment just come out of Protestantism. It's a popular narrative, it's a false narrative. And so the shift that's happening here that leads away from these classical arguments is one that is affected by people throughout the Western world. And that's within all Christian traditions. So a significant part of this is with a certain French Jesuit philosopher and priest named Pierre Charon. Now, it's not just Charon that does this, but Pierre Charon was a very influential figure in his time, and he had a profound influence on René Descartes, who's far more well-known than Charon himself is. Charon had a big impact on Pascal, if you think of Pascal's wager. And Charon had revived this kind of older Pyrrhonian philosophy, Pyrrhonian skepticism, this older classical philosophy that was basically skeptical, that took an approach to the world that essentially said that we should not really affirm with absoluteness anything, that the wisest of men is one who withholds judgment. And so we can never really know with absolute certainty what is true philosophically and what is not. And therefore we withhold judgment. Or when we do make affirmations about the world, or when we do make claims about the world, we do so somewhat loosely, always being open to being wrong. And so there is a certain kind of doubt that starts to occur in some philosophies that come from Charon about our knowledge of the world. And this has a really significant impact on questions like the existence of God. And Charon has a really big impact intellectually, especially in France and largely among Jesuits. So these moves away from classical philosophy are ones that are happening at least within France, but within large portions of the Roman Catholic world. And so it's not just the case that this is true among Protestants. As I said, many of at least the more Orthodox Protestants, both Lutherans and Reformed, they hold to these same classical metaphysical convictions. They're using the same kind of arguments that the medievals were using. But then you have people in France who are largely Roman Catholic Jesuits who are then moving away from that. So that's a big part of this picture. And so I just want to it's important to be fair here to say, and I'm not saying it's all Rome's fault, and a lot of Roman Catholics like to say it's all Luther's fault, and I'm not going to play the same game by saying it's their fault, it's all their fault either. My point is just to say that there are a lot of factors in this, and these factors affect everybody. And every tradition's kind of responding to these things in different ways, but we're all dealing with the same crises and the same doubts about the world and the way that we had understood the world in the prior medieval era. All right, so you've got this rise of skepticism. You also have this movement known as sometimes called the Second Scholasticism. Suarez is the major figure within this, and he's a Roman Catholic scholastic, hugely influential. And Suarez is someone who impacts people from various traditions as well. So he's used by at least the later of the Lutheran Orthodox during this 17th century post-Reformation scholastic era too. So Suarez is hugely influential. But Suarez in some ways is in continuity with the scholasticism of St. Thomas, but in some pretty significant ways, he departs from St. Thomas, particularly in his understanding of the relationship between essence and existence. And there are debates about how to categorize Suarez's philosophical system, but there are at least several arguments that his metaphysics, his views of nature and reality, are essentially a nominalist one, which is the view that is generally opposed to what's called realism, which is St. Thomas Aquinas' view. Okay, so these shifts are happening within Rome too. So again, there's continuity and discontinuity with St. Thomas. The perception that people I think have today about the Roman Church is that the Roman Church has always been thoroughly and consistently Thomistic in its metaphysic and its approach to reality. And the fact is that in the post-Reformation church, that wasn't really true. Now, there, of course, were always those within the church who held to Thomas's views, But in many ways, they had kind of fallen out of favor until the 19th century. And you see that with, again, what I had mentioned already with the rise of people like Sharon, or you have Suarez's system, which is hugely influential. And St. Thomas Aquinas kind of comes back into vogue. So there's a Thomistic revival in the 19th century. And the 19th century is a time where people are starting to search for answers to the challenges of modernity with things that are more ancient, things that are older. So this is the reason why within the 19th century, you have the rise of the Anglo-Catholic movement in England, where there's a group of individuals within the Anglican communion who are seeking to recover more kind of high church liturgical traditions because they want to identify themselves with the past. The 19th century is really the rise of conservative movements, of conservatism as an ideology throughout the Western world, especially with the challenges of the radicalism of someone like Karl Marx that's happening at this particular time. And so there is kind of a reaction against the Enlightenment and looking to things that are older. And it's in the midst of this, with the challenges of modernism, that Thomas Aquinas then becomes a formidable intellect to challenge modern ideas with a much older philosophy. And so this culminates with an encyclical from Pope Leo XIII, Aeterna Patris, in 1879, where Thomas Aquinas is made really the official teacher of the Roman Church. He's called the angelic doctor. And so this cements this revival of Thomas. But I just think it's important to recognize that it's not like there is this consistent line of Thomas wrote the Summa, and then the Summa becomes the primary theological text till today. It's just not the case. But the 19th century sees similar revivals among Protestant groups as well. As I mentioned, you see this with the Anglicans. Of course, the Anglo-Catholics don't like to call themselves Protestant, but of this retrieval of more classic traditions. Within Lutheranism, you get a confessional revival. People are once again reading the older 17th century sources, and these people are again using classical philosophy and classical arguments. And so this revival actually does happen not just within Rome, but it does happen certainly within the Lutheran world. The Reformed world, you have to ask somebody that knows that more than I do. So, because I'm very familiar with kind of the Princeton school of the 19th century, but they're not quite classical in a traditional sense, probably, but in some ways they are. But so you see these kind of revivals, and people are starting to say, we need to look toward the older sources to find answers to what we're facing in the world today. And so you see that in Rome, but you see that among Lutherans as well. Then the question, of course, is, well, people are doing that in the 19th century. What the heck happens in the 20th century? Because it doesn't seem like that's as prominent there in that century. And that is true, but we'll talk about this. Okay, so then let's talk about, so that was the kind of first thing that happens, right? I'm talking post-Reformation, move away from Thomas, which again is recovered in the 19th century. But then we have another thing that starts to occur in this post-Reformation era, and that is that there is an increasing separation between theology on the one hand and philosophy on the other. It's hard to exactly categorize this or to kind of pin it on one person or one era to say that this is where it happens. Sharon does that in some pretty profound ways, but you find this also among Protestant theologians. So one of the places where at least a lot of 19th century thinkers that are trying to kind of recover these more classical sources, someone that they at least put the blame on, is a guy named George Calixtus. And Calixtus, his years are 1586 to 1656. And Calixtus was a very controversial figure in his time, and I'm not going to get into the details of that. But one of the things that Calixtus did was he released a book on ethics, which was pretty popular at the time. But in his ethics, he really started to strongly divorce ethics as a broader philosophical discipline from Christian ethics. In other words, the moral life of the regenerate. How do the regenerates live? So in older ethics sources, and not just older, but a bunch in his time too, but in other ethics sources during the post-Reformation era or Reformation era, you look at someone like Philip Melanchthon, for example, or Paul von Eitzen. They are speaking about ethics as a broad discipline, a philosophical discipline, and a discipline that Christianity speaks to. And so they are able to do things like interact with what, the Stoics said about this or that, or with what Plato said, or, Plotinus, or whoever, right? Seneca. So they can interact with the pagan sources and bring them into conversation with Christian truth, because they understand that though philosophy and theology obviously are distinct, and they do distinguish them in those books, they're not exactly the same discipline. When we're dealing with these topics like ethics, we recognize that God's truth interacts with the truths that are there just through reason or natural revelation too. They're not strictly divided into these different spheres. So Calixtus does this with ethics, and this starts a trend. So you have this trend then away from integration of philosophy and theology into separation. And so even those theologians that are really engaged in philosophy write books, here's my theological book and here's my philosophical book, and they're totally different, right? They're kind of totally different spheres or realms altogether. And what this then leads to, at least in certain accounts, is within pietism. Now, pietism, if you're not familiar with pietism is a movement within Germany, which is kicked off by the publication of a book by Philip Jacob Spener. And this book is called Pia Desideria, Pious Desires, 1675. This book is published. And Spener argues that in the situation in the church in Germany at this time, that there had been such a strong focus on Orthodox theology. There were a ridiculous amount of materials published, great materials published, about theology and philosophy that were so theoretical that Spener was concerned that the practical elements of the heart and practical Christianity was kind of being left by the wayside. And by other accounts, including those of the strongly Lutheran Orthodox, there was truth to what Spener was saying. And so pastors, would get in the pulpit, and rather than proclaiming something that was meaningful to the congregation, they just nitpicked little pieces of Orthodox theology and philosophy that really weren't applicable to the average person at all. And so a lot of evaluations of pietism are very negative. I don't think it's entirely negative. I think there's both good and bad in it. But one of the negative things about pietism is that this kind of cemented this division that began growing between theology and philosophy. Then what happens is the Enlightenment. And so you get a number of challenges now to classical Christian truth. And so one of the responses to the Enlightenment was to retreat into experience, to say that we can't handle these kind of intellectual challenges. Not everybody's a scientist, and not everybody's reading, David Hume or something, or is able to or wants to. And so it was kind of easier, instead of challenging these things on an intellectual level, to retreat into experience. And so doing that kind of cements this divorce between theology and on the one hand, and then philosophy on the other hand. And Ernst Sartorius, who's one of my favorite theologians, 19th century German author, he's going to argue that this separation actually leads to Kant's philosophy. And I think there's a pretty strong case that he makes for that. But again, probably not time for that quite. Okay, so the separation between theology and philosophy starts to grow during the Enlightenment era. So that then leads to the third point that I want to make in terms of what shifted, why we lost these kind of classical arguments for the existence of God. And that is the Enlightenment. Right? So the Enlightenment began to challenge classical metaphysics, meaning classical ways of viewing the world or viewing reality. And so you see this with, and I mentioned I have three kind of major figures here. There are a lot more than that, but the three major figures here are Descartes, Hume, and Kant. And I say these three because in a way you can see such a clear development from those three figures from each other. They're not the only figures that are involved within this move away from classical convictions by any means. Descartes, who's really building off of Chiron, and in some ways Descartes is, I think, trying to answer Chiron's skepticism, because Descartes is not a total skeptic. But nonetheless, if you look at Descartes' method in his meditations, and I have 2 hours, but two-part lecture on Descartes if you want to listen to that to get more context. And I have one on Kant and Hume too. So I'll try to remember to put links below on this if you want to delve into those in depth. But Descartes starts his philosophy with skepticism. Right? He starts his philosophy by saying, well, I'm going to start by doubting that anything exists and see if I can find a provable point and build a philosophy off of this absolutely logically certain point, which becomes now the starting point of philosophy. And that's how he comes up with his very famous cogito ergo sum phrase. I think, therefore I am. So, okay, well, I think, and therefore if I'm thinking, there must be a thinker. And so if I think, I must exist. And so I exist as a thinker. And then he builds a philosophy off of there. But this really moves away from a view that says, I can observe the world around me, objectively believing it exists, and then reason from the external world toward invisible transcendent truths. And that's the real shift that now makes the arguments that are in Thomas not really work anymore. Because if you're coming to the world with an assumption of skepticism that the external world even exists, skepticism that the external world and your senses can actually reveal truth to you, well, then you can't reason from motion in the world towards God's existence, because you're starting with the question of, well, how do I know there even is motion in the world? And so Hume is going to do this with causes. And Hume famously does this and makes this argument that we don't actually know that a cause and an effect are related. What we actually know is that I experience one thing with my senses, and this other thing is something else I tend to experience after, right? So it tends to be that if I sense my foot kicking a ball, then my sense of sight sees that ball move. So I logically, make an assumption that, event A caused event B. But Hume says we can't really know that for sure, and we can't actually determine inherent connections of cause and effect. That's kind of beyond us. Kant tries to escape skepticism, and in doing so creates just another form of skepticism. And maybe not quite as extreme as someone like David Hume, but Kant ends up saying that there's this strong difference between what's called the noumenal and the phenomenal realm, which essentially is this idea that there is this strong distinction between the worlds that I sense and then the objective universal truths that I can know intellectually. And I can't reason from just my experience and events that I see toward these kind of universal truths about the invisible world, essentially. And that's really simplified. But again, I've got more stuff on this. So the point to understand, though, with that is just to say that the assumptions of how people started to view the world shifted far away from the way that the world must be seen for Thomas's arguments to work. And so it's largely because of that people just don't find them as effective anymore. And so they're arguing in many different ways. And one of those is to talk about kind of intuitive beliefs or preconditions for knowledge or experience, which is something that Kant does. And that's what someone like Cornelius Van Til is going to do with presuppositional apologetics. So he's going to shift the focus now toward what are the assumptions that I have that are necessary for anything to make sense to me, or for me to even understand or have experiences. Kant does this with the transcendental arguments for time and space. Though there's some debate as to whether he actually believed those to be existent things. It doesn't seem that he did necessarily. Okay, so that's the third thing that happens. And then the fourth of these, and this is what I think affects this more than anything else in modern times. So this fourth one, I think, is the reason why this move, even though the 19th century had this kind of revival of more classical views and more classical philosophy, the 20th century moved away from that. And so here's the primary reason: the Hellenization thesis. And the Hellenization thesis has wreaked havoc on everything. I think so. Okay, Hellenization thesis. What the heck do I mean by that? Well, this was something that was most famously taught, at least, by Adolf von Harnack. Now, Adolf von Harnack was one of probably the last major representative of the school of thought that's known as Protestant liberalism from the 19th century. And Harnack's years are 1851 to 1930. And so Harnack is a figure who lives during that bridge between what was Protestant liberalism, that which was influenced by Schleiermacher and then Ritschl, and the neo-orthodoxy of someone like Karl Barth. So Harnack is most well known as a church historian, and a church historian, again, from the Protestant liberal tradition. So Harnack posits, you can find F.C. Bauer has kind of some earlier ideas like this, so it's not totally new here, but he posits that there was a gradual Hellenization of early Christianity. And so essentially the idea is that that early Christians were more indebted to their Jewish roots in the way that they viewed God and the way that they viewed the world around them. And there was this gradual process where in the Greco-Roman world, as Christianity spread, it started to adopt the ideas of the Greco-Roman world, which were foreign from the Jewish worldview. And so as people began to adopt these ideas of the Greco-Roman world, and in doing that kind of lost elements of their more Jewish, Hebraic worldview, the way that God was viewed and the way that nature was viewed started to totally shift. And this leads to a view of church history, especially the medieval era, but the patristic era too, which tries to find the kind of genuine germ of real, authentic Hebraic Christianity and separate that from these kind of Greek philosophical impositions. And you see this a little bit earlier in the 19th century with Isaac August Dorner, who writes this book on divine immutability. He was a very influential theologian, and Dorner wasn't really a Protestant liberal either. He was kind of a mediating figure between Orthodoxy and Protestant liberalism. But Dorner argued that the Reformers didn't go far enough because the Reformers, yes, they recovered a doctrine of justification by faith, but they failed to recover what he calls a truly evangelical doctrine of God, which for him is a God that is not unchangeable in essence. And so he denies divine immutability, and he sees this as, again, an absorption of Greek ideas. So Dorner in some ways sets the stage for this too, but Harnack does it most popularly. So there is this antithesis between the Greeks and the Jews in the way that they viewed the world. So the Hellenization thesis then really dominates so much of 20th century theology, and it happens everywhere. And so this does happen in Rome as well. Now, Rome, because of the encyclical that we talked about in 1879, they can't totally throw out Thomas. And so just by nature of the way that authority is viewed in Rome, they can't go quite as far with the Hellenization thesis as many of the Protestants do. Of course, I would say that that's supposed to be the point of our confessional documents, because our confessional documents don't allow the Hellenization thesis. If you're a Lutheran, at least they don't. Divine simplicity is in the first article of the Augsburg Confession, which is the primary foundational confession of faith of the Reformation, and certainly of the Lutheran Reformation, but also just as a whole. And also, if you're a confessional Lutheran, holds to the Formula of Concord. The Formula of Concord explicitly affirms Aristotelian distinctions between, substance and accident. So you can't get around metaphysical realism in some form if you hold to Reformation confessions. So I say these churches that hold to confessions of faith, we shouldn't have let it happen either, because theoretically it shouldn't have happened. But frustrations that I have that are coming through here. Okay, so in the 20th century, people start to adopt this kind of thesis. And you have all these forms of existential Thomism and stuff and not all of that is really moving away from Thomas, but some of it really is. But it so dominates the way that people start viewing God that there is then the dominance of what has now been labeled theistic mutualism or theistic personalism. Okay, so to just quickly explain these terms. Theistic personalism is a term coined by a Roman Catholic philosopher named Brian Davies. Theistic mutualism is a term that was coined by Reformed Baptist James Dolezal, also a philosopher, great philosopher and theologian as well, who's really well-versed in these classical sources. And these views essentially say that the way that God is now looked at is that God is looked at as more as personal than anything else. This becomes the dominating way that God is viewed, because it is argued that the Greek view of divinity is impersonal. And the Greek view of God, and now we're talking about the Greek gods of like the pantheon, but the Greek philosophical view of God at least, is a God who can't really relate to creatures because he can't change and he can't interact. Now, it's argued that, well, if God is really relational, Scripture certainly portrays God to be relational, God has to actually interact with creatures. And you can't really have an interaction or a relation without some kind of change on the part of both parties. So if God really hears our prayers, if God really repents, as Scripture says that he does at times, then therefore God must be capable of change. And so then this view of God starts to dominate. We call theistic personalism or mutualism, which denies that God is simple, meaning that he's not composed of parts, which denies that God is absolutely unchangeable. There are ways of talking about immutability and simplicity and other contexts that depart from the classical definitions of those things. And when you start to do that, right, when you start to move toward a God who, for some, exists in time, or time is God. It's like the Father is the past, the Son is the present, the Spirit is the future, is like Robert Jensen's going to say. Well, then the classical arguments don't work. Because you don't have an unmoved mover if he's moving all the time. He's changing all the time. And so the dominance of theistic personalism, again, which I think really depends on the Hellenization thesis, that plus a reaction to modernism, which is a retreating to experience in the Bible and a retreat from philosophy, these all converge and create what we have at the present moment. I think that where we are today, and that's where I want to end here. Where we are today is we are at a place where, yes, those who are kind of trained in maybe that kind of Biola school of apologetics, they're all dependent upon this more theistic personalist kind of view of God, which means that they don't hold to classical metaphysics, and they're not going to make the classical arguments. And that stream is still very strong. But there has been a very consistent revival of classical theism. You see, it's all over the place. Because I think what a lot of people are recognizing within the Protestant world is that these arguments, it's not even just the arguments, but the arguments that have been put forward as the strongest, in some ways don't address the most central questions. And the classical philosophy gives a coherent and cohesive view of the world in terms of the questions of things like, how do I know reality? How do I know I exist? How do I know the world exists? And it understands that God is other than us. And this is, of course, the problem with any kind of theistic mutualism is the question is, well, why is this, what makes this, say, God any different from an all-powerful alien? This is why you have people that say, buy into maybe the intelligent design arguments. Like there are intelligent design theorists who don't believe in God because they just believe aliens put us here. Right? And we need more than that. Like God is not a being that is just like us, who is just more powerful than us, who exists kind of somewhere out there and interacts with us in some ways, or who perhaps is somewhat divorced from the happenings of everyday life. And it's a whole other discussion. But we need to understand a God who is the source of all things and all motion and all being at all times, who is not like me, because I need a foundation that is very not me. I don't want one that is like me. And that God is the foundation of all being and all motion and all things. And I think there are a lot of kind of cultural things that are leading a lot of people that were raised in the church and with this, Josh McDowell type of apologetics. And I don't mean to like dismiss that or the usefulness of that by any means, but who just at some point found that we needed something deeper and really more compelling and all-encompassing. And you find that within these classical approaches. So what we are seeing now is a turn back to classical Protestantism, a return back to classical views about God. And now there are a number of institutes that exist to, at least in part, promote more of these classical views. We have ours, the Widener Institute here with Justin Sinner. We have the Davenant Institute has done a lot of work in in this, and we have Credo with St. Matthew Barrett, who was a Baptist but is now an Anglican, and there are a number of other institutes like this too that are doing similar work. So what I do think that we are going to see and are in the midst of seeing is really a return to classical apologetics and classical metaphysics from Christians of all different traditions. And I think one good thing about this is that, I'm not ready to, go join Rome or something, but these are really important areas of overlap that in the midst of this secular world, in the midst of the challenges of skepticism, and the challenges of modernity, there really are these really strong points of convergence, I think, that we do have with our, say, Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, or those who are in the Reformed traditions. I'm Lutheran, or Anglican, or wherever. And I think that these are issues that we can really kind of come together on, really central issues that we can come together on, and support each other's work on these things. So, thanks so much for watching. I know this is there's just so much of this history. Everything I say here, I want to say so much more, so it's so hard to keep it concise, but I wanted to keep it around an hour, and I did okay here. So let me know if you want me to go more into any of these. I'm happy to do that. Again, I wrote multiple books that really cover this area, so I'm happy to talk about any of this in any more depth. And so make sure you subscribe if you haven't yet, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.